When you tell a story, you spark a connection. That's how humans have communicated since the beginning of time. We told stories long before we invented alphabets. The human brain is hardwired to communicate through stories. Stories keep cultures alive. We engage with others through stories. We are drawn to stories because we see ourselves reflected in them. Through stories, we share passions, fears, sadness, and joys, and we find common ground with other people so that we can connect and communicate with them. Stories show us what we have in common with others. We learn to engage with others despite our differences as we come to understand who they are. Everyone has stories to tell. Your perspective shapes the meaning of your stories. Here's one of my stories. I grew up in Houston, finishing high school in 1961. The Supreme Court 1954 decision, Brown v. Board of Education, was still widely resisted in that area, so there were no black kids in my schools. The pervasive racism of that time and place became clear to me through the revelations of the civil rights movement. My education from my parents, schools, church, and friends created an unconscious presumption that black people were different, possibly dangerous, foreign, and unknown. But as the sit-ins and media attention to the ugliness of racism reached my heart, I adopted a different attitude. I was not assertive about it. I certainly wasn't likely to demonstrate, although I did a little bit of tutoring black community elementary school kids. But the way I looked at black people shifted away from my parents' viewpoint. That led to some intense verbal conflicts, especially with my father. He had no shame about being racist. He contended that he had many years of experience with black and Mexican people that formed his impressions of their intrinsic character. And I just lacked that experience. In a restaurant with my family one time, he pointed out a group at a table across the room and asked us, "What kind of people do you think they are?" I understood exactly what he was doing. He was labeling them Cajuns, Mexicans, Jews, Yankees, whatever. I answered immediately, Americans. As I recall the interchange, that flustered him a little bit. That's the end of that story. When you hear others' stories, you come to realize that you share some of the same fundamental experiences, and yet your experiences differ from each other because everyone has a different perspective. When you hear a story, you step out of your reality and place yourself in someone else's shoes. If you want to know how to live well, you'll need stories.
Thank you, Don, and that made me hungry. And thank you for the music today, Maria. Music and stories connect us in immeasurable ways. My privilege as a white-skinned, cisgendered woman might sometimes blind me from injustice. Mostly, though, I find myself wanting to get into some good trouble, to disrupt the culture of white supremacy, to dismantle racism. I've developed the practices of showing up for Black and Indigenous people in their spaces and of reading the stories and poetry of people who don't look like me. Supporting BIPOC authors, being in those spaces and doing that reading offers me connection and the awareness and courage to act in anti-racist ways. That slide. Meet Carl Poole. The one on the right, or yeah, you're right. So, Carl Poole. Some of you may already follow his adventures with my friend and a member of this congregation, Reverend Viola Abbott. Viola currently serves as a settled minister That's Viola at the door. My husband and I, that's me in the other corner and my husband, and Viola is in the middle. Reverend Viola currently serves as a settled minister with Coastal Virginia Unitarian Universalists in Virginia Beach. She introduced us to Carl in 2021 when we met her at Ferry Beach, where she was serving as a chaplain for the summer. Since we're all in different states now, Trish Williams, V, and I still meet for a bodacious breakfast once a month by Zoom and occasionally arrange an in-person rendezvous somewhere in the country. V has graciously given me the permission to share the Carl story. Carl is a dummy, but he's way more than a dummy. He protects V when she travels alone. As a Black woman, V does not feel particularly safe traveling alone, so Carl Poole is her travel companion. She's really creative, dressing him up for different destinations in different seasons with outfits and accessories. She pulls a blanket over him when she goes into stores and for rest stops, and she folds him up and packs him into a suitcase with all of his outfits and accessories when she's traveling far away and will be driving in unfamiliar places. Have I ever imagined I would need a dummy as a travel partner to keep me safe? I travel a lot by myself. No. V makes light of it. We laugh a lot about her stories. Carl's friends as scarecrows, those incidents when people see her pulling Carl out of the trunk of her car. It's funny. And yet, there is nothing funny about Carl. She calls it laughtivism, the strategic use of humor as a successful, nonviolent, and creative means of activism and resistance. Laughter is medicine as it melts fear and opens a way to manage the very real menace of white supremacy. Knowing Carl Poole is both funny and clarifying, there is no doubt about my privilege where my friend is ever vigilant. I take my safety for granted. She finds ways to laugh about the threats to her safety instead. So the next slide was about a James Baldwin quote. He's cute, right? So if we listen to James Baldwin, he explains it this way. If one really wishes to know how justice is administered in this country, one does not question the policemen, the lawyers, the judges, or the protected members of the middle class. One goes to the unprotected and listens to their testimony. When we begin to recognize injustice, we may choose good trouble, to act in ways that disrupt the culture that holds oppression in place. I've been going to physical therapy for 4 months at a PT group in Malta for this crazy broken arm. It's way better though, right? After many visits, I noticed there were no Black or brown or Asian therapists ever, and no Black, brown, or Asian clients ever. I know people of all cultures occasionally have injuries like the rest of us, so where were the injured? It just seemed really strange. So I finally asked to speak to the administrator, to whom I described my surprise that this was such a very white space. She responded, "Well, we get the very best therapists." That hit me really hard as white supremacy. I canceled all of my appointments at that group and wrote a letter to the headquarters. I researched other PT groups around to find one with a more multicultural environment, therapists and clients. I found one, and on my first visit, I felt way more at home at a space where there were Black therapists and clients. I spoke the truth and prioritized my values while realizing I felt at home in a multicultural community. I want that for UU Schenectady. Again, from James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And about facing reality, has anyone seen the video of the Alabama riverboat brawl? Do y'all know what I'm talking about? Nodding heads? Yeah, okay. Watching that video of the brawl is a good reminder that the menace of white supremacy is real, very, very real. My friend and Schenectady City Council member Damani Farley refers to that event as the riverboat resistance, a valuable perspective from the unprotected. We might not always be in multicultural spaces, interacting in deep or superficial ways with everyone in this space. What we can do is pay attention and find ways to educate ourselves about the menace Black, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander, and LGBTQ folks face every day in many spaces. Without a deep awareness of racism and the needed work of anti-racism, any of us is susceptible to fascist tactics. There is a connection between the work of anti-racism and keeping fascism at bay. Some of you may have participated recently in the Side with Love session combating fascism within and without with Reverend Ashley Horan and the Reverend Cecilia Kingman. Reverend Kingman sees that people can be susceptible to fascist tactics as they act in ways that maintain power with a greater good thinking. The question is, who is good? We can be sucked in by our own privilege. An example is a behavior referred to as obeying in advance. If you found yourself being concerned about the Black Lives Matter banner or the LGBTQ sign that it may incite civil violence from the community, you may be falling into obeying in advance thinking. Upholding a system of power. You see, fascists hold the power if we choose not to advertise our support for our Black and LGBT folks because of a fear of our safety. That is folding to the white straight power structures in advance of any civil violence by fascists. We fail to live into our values and we limit how we move in the world as Unitarian Universalists if we prevent potential violence threatened by fascists. To prevent potential violence threatened by fascists, we take the signs down. We must have competency in anti-racism in order to fight fascism. If we don't, we are susceptible. In our privileged identities, we can convince ourselves that racism is not that bad, that fascism is not here in Schenectady. It doesn't get bad overnight. It gets bad on a trajectory. Yet, we find hope and inspiration in resistance, in coalitions, in connection. Stories from books written by Black, Brown, Asian, and LGBTQ people who experience life differently than cis, straight, white people can help us acknowledge those differences, those experiences, and face the reality of white supremacy in our congregations and in our communities. Facing the realities that we might not be able to sense is the challenge of creating change and creating justice, as in our mission statement. We'll soon begin a transition from the anti-racism team to a widening the circle team, really perfect for the architecture here, right? We'll continue with the BIPOC book group as we continue to educate ourselves for a multicultural way of being. Nicole Presley of UUA's Side with Love expressed it perfectly in a recent email. The success of our movements depends on our capacity to hold a larger vision of what we seek to build, not just what we seek to dismantle. And as we engage in collective learning about fascism and how we dismantle the systems of oppression that feed anti-democratic movements, we must also find collective space to imagine and build the world where all live in the fullness and wholeness of our worth and dignity. I hope for all of the fullness and wholeness possible for this congregation. Keep reading and resisting as we open our hearts more fully.
Now we're going to segue to Latin America, specifically Mexico. I absolutely adored the book, The Murmur of Bees by Sofia Segovia. It takes place in Mexico from approximately 1900 to 1920, although the narrator is actually telling the story many years after the fact. As some of you know, my husband and I have been spending 3 months each winter in Mexico, and altogether we've lived there for over 4 years. We've made a concerted effort to learn Mexican history, which is incredibly complex and confusing. But throughout it all, I have consistently sided with the little guys, that is, the peasants, the workers, rather than elite landowners. I'm a good liberal UU after all. The, the Murmur of Bees is told from the standpoint of a major landowner and his family. This is a good landowner, of course, one who is honest and fair with his workers. It was a different experience for me to identify with this family and hope that they succeeded in maintaining their property from the various corrupt governments, which were theoretically at least confiscating land and giving parcels to the peasants. It was eye-opening for me to get caught up in this story of a family working extremely hard to maintain their land, which to them was second only in value to that they placed on their family itself. The other thing that enamored me to this book was the heavy dose of what is typically called magical realism included. Semenopio, a major character, is a seemingly mute individual, and he's an adopted member of the family. He has the ability to communicate with bees, and he can also talk with the youngest member of the family, who's the narrator. Semenopio personifies the indigenous connection to the land that most of us in the so-called developed world lack. I'm going to share a few things about bees that I learned independent of this book. The reality is that bees have a sophisticated form of language. Their waggle dance has been observed since antiquity. A single worker bee waggles her abdomen from side to side while walking in a figure-8 pattern over and over again. Other bees follow her lead, imitating the pattern while touching the lead dancer's abdomen with their antenna. This pattern encodes the direction to the food source relative to the sun's position in the sky. The length of the dance is related to the distance the bees must travel. So bee language is not like human language. It's primarily spatial and vibrational. The type, frequency, angle, and amplitude of vibrations made by the bees' bodies, particularly their abdomens and wings, as they move through space, all have meaning. In addition to this dance, bees make many other types of signals through nuanced movements and through sounds and vibrations largely inaudible or indecipherable to the average human. So while reading the book, Semenopio seemed to be performing magic while communicating with the bees. Yet it was his close connection to the bees, his deep listening, that enabled him to understand them and to call upon them for help. I want to put in a plug for our next book, which is entitled The House on Mango Street by Sarah Cisneros. I've read at least 4 books by this author and recently reread the Mango Street book. It's very different from The Murmur of Bees and just as compelling in its own way. It's really a coming-of-age novel describing 1 year in the life of a 12-year-old Mexican-American girl living in a poverty-stricken barrio in Chicago. One of the learnings from reading each of these BIPOC books is that they describe a particular reality. There is no one Mexican-American experience or only one Black or Asian experience. Reading about lives that are fundamentally different from mine in all their nuances has helped to broaden my viewpoint and helped to counter the stereotypes that frequently appear in the media. I hope that you'll be motivated to join us on Zoom once a month to participate in or listen to the discussion of each of the chosen books. I will value your comments and insights.